In this video, I will show you exactly how to master case interviews and land offers at McKinsey, Bain, and BCG step by step. In fact, I've used this exact approach to help over 400 candidates secure MBB offers. And don't worry, this is not going to be the same case interview advice like being messy or practice a lot. Yes, it helps, and since this is a beginner's guide, we will cover the basics. But if you want to truly stand out in MBB interviews, that surface level advice is not going to cut it. What will? The 4 types of case interviews and the 5-step approach I'm going to share with you. Okay, so let's start with the definition of a case interview. A case interview is a problem-solving test. Consulting firms want to assess your capacity to solve complex business problems. For instance, a problem you might have to solve as a consultant or during your interviews is the following one. Our client is a major manufacturer of spare parts for the automotive industry. And today, they are looking to expand and are considering entering the airline business. So they hired our team to help them decide whether or not to move into this new industry. How would you help them? But it's very difficult to solve such complex business problems in one go. So consulting firms expect you to break down these problems into smaller, easier to solve problems. So they want to see if you can identify and solve mini problems. For instance, for the market entry case, the list of mini problems to solve can be, is it profitable to enter this new market? Another mini problem can be, how can our client create a competitive advantage? Another mini problem can be, does our client know how to manufacture spare parts for the airline industry? After you have identified these mini problems, they expect you to solve them. For instance, to solve the first mini problem, is it profitable to enter this new market? The analysis you might have to do is first forecasting the expected revenues and cost, and secondly, performing a break-even analysis. Okay, now let's discuss the assessment criteria used by top consulting firms. Before we dive into these criteria, you must understand this. Your logic, your reasoning is much more important than the answer itself. There is no right or wrong answer in a case interview. However, they want to understand the path you took to find the answer. Now let's discuss the 4 main criteria used by consulting firms to assess your case interview performance. Case structuring, case leadership, case analytics, and communication. Case structuring is your ability to logically break down problems. Like we saw before, it's your capacity to identify the different mini problems that must be solved to solve the main problem. Case analytics means prioritization. It's your capacity to identify the 20% of issues or 20% of mini problems that will solve 80% of the problem. Case analytics is your ability to analyze data and, more important, to turn this analysis into business insights. And finally, communication is your capacity to communicate like a consultant, to speak like a consultant. They want to see if you can communicate clearly and concisely your ideas. You might have hundreds of different types of case interviews. However, these case interviews can be grouped together in 4 archetypes. So let's discuss that. The 4 archetypes are fix something bad, take a strategic decision, improve a metric, and market sizing. Let's start with fix something bad. A fix something bad problem is actually a situation when your client has a metric going in the wrong direction. And they want to know why, they want a diagnosis, and they want a solution to fix it. For instance, a case like this can be your client is a retailer like Zara, and they've been experiencing declining sales, and they want to understand why. How would you help them? So think of all the case questions like declining profits, declining sales, increasing cost. Okay? A metric is going in the wrong direction. The second archetype of problem is called take a strategic decision. In this situation, you want to help a client take a decision. You want to help them assess the different conditions that must be met in order to take that decision. For instance, the case we discussed at the beginning. Our client is a major manufacturer of spare parts for the automotive industry, and they want to enter the airline market. So here, think of all the problems like market entry, launching a new product, acquisition of another company, acquiring a new company. The archetype number 3 is called improve a metric. In this situation, your client wants to improve a metric. They want to know how they can optimize a metric. For instance, increasing sales, increasing profits, decreasing cost, increasing productivity. For instance, the case can be your client operates an in-store and they want to increase the traffic on their website. How would you help them? And finally, the last archetype of problems you might have in your case interviews is called market sizing. Here, the objective is to estimate the size of something, most of the time a market, with no or little data. For instance, can you estimate the size of the airline spare part market in the US? Again, you might have hundreds of different questions in your case interviews. But all these questions will fit one of these 4 archetypes. Now let's discuss how to solve case interviews. Consultants use this 5-step approach to solve problems. And they expect you to follow the same approach in your case interviews. The 5-step approach is the following one. First, opening the case. You must listen to your interviewers when they share with you the case prompt. Secondly, you want to clarify the problem. You want to define precisely the scope of the problem you have to solve. Third, you want to develop a plan, a framework, in order to solve the problem. Number 4, you need to solve the problem, okay? You need to solve all the mini problems you have identified in the previous step and combine all these mini solutions together to solve the main problem. And number 5, you want to close the case, you want to share your solution with the interviewer. Let's discuss in details these 5 steps. Step number 1, opening the case. Here your job is very easy. You just need to listen and take notes. To take notes, I recommend to divide your piece of paper like this. On the left side, where you are taking notes, at the top you can write the objective of the case, and in the middle, leave some space to write down the framework you will use to solve the problem. Okay, step number 2, clarifying the problem. And this is a very important step because you can assume that all the problem statements you will have in your case interviews will be ambiguous. You can assume that some keywords will be ambiguous. You can assume that some critical information will be missing. Why? Because consultants do that on purpose. They want to see how you deal with ambiguity. When you will be a consultant, your clients will be ambiguous. So part of your job will be to remove any ambiguity. So let's see how you can do that. To clarify a problem, you must clarify 3 things: the client context, the client objective, and the client's limitations. For the client context, you want to understand precisely the product or service they are offering. You want to know the geography they are operating in. And finally, you want to have an overview of the value chain. Let's start with the product or service. For the product or service, for instance, it's important that you do not make any assumption. For instance, if I tell you your client is manufacturing cars, you know what a car is. But there are so many different types of cars. Is it a luxury car, an electric car, a mass market car? You want to know precisely what we are talking about. Next, the client objective. Here, you want to define precisely the problem metric. You want to define precisely the metric your client wants to optimize. And then you want to know by how much and by when. And finally, the client's limitations. You want to know any limitations they might have to solve this problem. It can be external limitations or internal limitations. Let's see some sample questions using the market entry case we discussed at the beginning of this video. To define the client context, you can ask questions such as what specific automotive parts do they manufacture currently? What specific airline parts do they want to manufacture? Who are and who will be their main customers? What is their current geographic presence? To define the client objective, you can ask questions such as why are they specifically interested in the airline industry? What time frame do they have in mind for this expansion? And what are the growth targets for this new venture? It can be sales, profits, ROI. You want to understand precisely what is the problem metric. And finally, you must clarify the client's limitations. To do so, you can ask questions such as, is there any regulatory limitation I should be aware of? Are there any financial constraints beyond the current operating budget? What's important is to be precise. You want to know precisely the scope and the objective of the case. It's very different if you say something like, I want to increase sales, and if you say something like, I want to increase sales by $10 million within 2 years without making investments. In the first case, you cannot say, I have solved your problem, because you don't know. In the second situation, you have a very clear ending line. Okay, step number 3, structure. This is when you have to develop a plan, a roadmap to solve the problem. We discussed at the beginning that you must identify all the mini problems that must be solved in order to solve the main problem. And all these mini problems are called a framework or an issue tree or a structure. That's the same words for me. But you cannot have like a random list of mini problems. This list of mini problems must follow some rules, some principles. And your framework must follow 2 principles: being messy and being tailored. Let's start with the first one, the first principle, being messy. Messy is an acronym that means mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. And it's also a grouping principle to ensure that you will solve in an efficient way the problem. Let's start with mutually exclusive. Mutually exclusive means there is no overlap in the different mini problems you have identified. Let's take an example. Imagine you want to know why the sales of Coca-Cola dropped. If you break down this problem like this, saying like, okay, let's analyze the sales of Diet Coke, of a specific product line. And secondly, let's analyze the sales in the US. You can see here there is an overlap because they are selling Diet Coke in the US. And it's not efficient because if you give the first analysis to a consultant and the second analysis to another consultant, they will do the same work. Now let's discuss the second part of the messy principle, collectively exhaustive. It means that there is no gap. You have a comprehensive list of mini problems that must be analyzed. Let's take the same Coca-Cola example. If you want to know why the sales of Coca-Cola dropped, you can, for instance, analyze the sales of Coca-Cola in different geographies. In Americas, in Europe, in Africa. But if you miss to analyze the sales in Asia, you might actually miss the reason why the total sales or the global sales dropped. So to summarize, your framework must be messy. You must actually identify all the mini problems that must be solved, and you must organize these mini problems in a hierarchy to make sure that there is no overlap. The second principle is that your framework must be tailored. Your framework must be tailored to the problem you have to solve and to the client business model. You cannot use generic frameworks. This is not what consultants do. They offer bespoke solutions to their clients. There are actually no 2 problems that are the same. And your frameworks must reflect that. Let's take an example. Imagine the following case prompt. Your client is a retailer like Zara, and they've been experiencing declining sales, and they want to understand why. How would you help them? If you use a generic framework like this one, okay, sales equal quantity time price, it's messy, okay? We cover the main components of sales, and there is no overlap. But it's very generic. It's not good enough. Instead, you want to ask yourself, What is driving sales for a retailer? What are the specific factors that are driving sales for a retailer? For instance, you can think of the number of transactions in that specific store and the average value per transaction. For the number of transactions, you want to think of maybe of the traffic, the number of people coming into the store and the conversion rate. How many of these people are actually buying something? For the traffic, you want to think of specific factors like the location of the store, the awareness, the reputation of the stores. You can see here we have much more specific factors driving sales. That's what interviewers expect from you. They want to see if you understand the business model of your client and if you can discuss the specific factors influencing the problem. Okay, to learn how to develop messy and tailored frameworks, check the link below. You will have access to a free training explaining exactly how to do it. Step number 4 is solving the case. So here, you must solve the mini problems you have identified before and put together all these solutions to solve the main problem. And to do that, you will have to perform different analysis. Okay? Or in other words, you interviewer will ask you different questions. And there are actually 6 types of questions your interviewer can ask you in a case interviews. There are some quantitative questions or quantitative analysis and some qualitative analysis. The first type is quantitative questions. They will ask you to calculate something given some assumptions. You have an example here. Given the following assumptions, how many units should they sell per year in order to break even? And then you have assumptions about the fixed cost, variable costs, and average price per unit. The second type of question is chart interpretation questions. They will give you some exhibits, tables, charts to analyze, and your job is to draw conclusions based on the data presented in these exhibits. The third type of question are market sizing questions, exactly like the archetype of problem we have discussed earlier. They might ask you to estimate the size of something with no or little data. You will have qualitative questions, so qualitative analysis to perform as well. The first one is brainstorming questions. They will ask you to come up with a list of ideas or factors. For instance, can you list all the potential risks our client can face if they decide to enter the airline business? Another qualitative analysis you might have to perform in your case interviews is to share your recommendation. Okay, that's something that happened at the end of the case, and we have a dedicated section in this video talking about this. But the question can be, for instance, okay, now you have a meeting with your client's management team. What is your recommendation? Obviously, they are testing your communication skills here. And finally, something extremely rare, but you might have questions like this. It's what I call meta questions. With meta questions, your interviewer wants to assess the process you will actually use in order to solve a problem, to answer a question. They don't expect an answer, but they expect the process you would follow in order to get this answer. For instance, a meta question can be, who would you talk to and what would you discuss with them in order to find out? Okay, finally, the step number 5, closing the case. This is when you are sharing your recommendation to the interviewer. Your interviewer will ask you a question such as, now you have a meeting with your client's management team, what is your recommendation? What's important here is you need to shift from an analytical mode to a presentation mode. You don't want to repeat all the analysis you have done. You want to jump directly to what the client should know in order to solve the problem. And for that, you must speak the C-level language. You must use something called top-down communication principle. Okay, you must start with actually the answer, your main message, and then follow with supporting arguments. For instance, for the market entry case, your recommendation can be, I recommend that our client should not enter the airline parts manufacturing industry at this time, as the high barriers to entry and require investment outweigh the potential benefits. And then you can continue with supporting arguments. Why you are saying that? For instance, number 1, the regulatory barriers create significant time and cost hurdles. Number 2, the technical expertise gap poses substantial operational risks. And number 3, market dynamics make profitability uncertain. Sometimes, but most often not, you can continue by sharing more supporting arguments, like you can see on this screen. Okay, that's it for today. Please like the video and check my free training in the link in the description.